Wondering why the slides weren't progressing the way they should, it's because of my inability to sing and click a button at the same time. I just can't say I can't do that. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I don't have that kind of coordination. But very grateful for all of y'all for being here. We're going to continue a sermon series that we've been working through this month and talking about boasting. Of all things, and what Paul is going to do with that, I'm going to have to stay right here. So if I wander off, you won't be able to hear me because I don't have anybody to change the mic for me. But so we're going to see how that works out. But we've been talking about boasting and using 2 Corinthians to work through that principle and work through that idea and what Paul is talking about. And I just wanted to kind of spend a little time talking about a worldly perspective of boasting, or a way in which we may perceive boasting. Maybe an illustration that would be helpful in understanding what Paul is communicating here. And so what I want you to think about is a job interview. So let's say you're going for a job interview, and you hand the person, the hiring manager, your resume, and they hold your resume, and they start looking through it, and they see things like your name and your address and your contact information, basic stuff. Maybe a title of your profession. This is who I am and what I do, and that's it. And that's all that your resume consists of. And so the hiring manager looks at you and he says, "Well, don't you have any work experience? Or maybe a certificates or any kind of education? I mean, haven't you accomplished anything in your life?" And you look at them and say, "Well, yes, of course I have, but I don't want to boast. And so I decided not to put any of those in my resume." Well, odds are you're probably not going to get the job if you don't provide that kind of information, right? Because that's what they're looking for. What kind of experience, what kind of certificates of achievement do you have in order to accomplish those things? So we can see that in both areas, boasting could be a bad thing. It could be a way for us to elevate ourselves and make ourselves look better, and it could be very prideful. So elevating ourselves and boasting about ourselves can be bad. But there are times when boasting, in some sense, if you want to call that boasting, is necessary. It's necessary to sing our praise when it is needed for a particular job or a particular work that we have. We need people to understand, hey, I am qualified for this job. I can do this job. I have experience. And people want that. And they want to be able to see that. And there's a fine line, I believe, with the attitude that goes behind it when somebody is boasting about their achievements, and the necessity for saying what needs to be said to give confidence that you can do what you say you can do. And so that's where we're at with our study in Paul's writing. So Paul has been dealing with, if you remember, this group of people that he calls lovingly the super apostles. And these are a group of people who are not ashamed to boast. They boast about everything. They want the Corinthians to think they're the best speakers, that they dress the best, that they're the greatest, and they have the most spirituality. And that's what they want. They want Paul to be recognized as the weaker. They want to be seen as wiser than Paul. They want to be seen as a better speaker than Paul. They want to be seen as better dressed than Paul. They want to be seen as those who have more credentials than Paul, so that Paul could be belittled and they can be exalted. And so Paul calls this group of people the super apostles, and they're bringing a particular kind of gospel and a particular kind of Jesus that is seemingly attractive to the Corinthians. And the Corinthians are being swayed into following these people who are claiming spirituality. They're claiming to be of Christ. And Paul has to go to bat, but he doesn't want to. Remember, he says it's something I don't really want to do. In fact, you're forcing me to do this. You're forcing me to talk about myself, and I don't want to talk about myself. I don't want to sit here and have to brag about all my accomplishments and my achievements. And remember what Paul's bragging was, right? Paul would say, I suffered for the name of Jesus. I went through hardships. I went through shipwrecks. I went through times in prison, that I have been beaten. I have been stoned nearly to death. That I have brethren who have come after me, against me. I've had further countrymen who have come against me. I have people who have sought to kill me. And that's what I will boast in. I will boast in my weakness to glorify and amplify the message of Jesus. But we understand the super apostles had a different goal. Their goal was to draw the Corinthians away, to suck them into their form of Christianity. And Paul says in 2 Corinthians, since many boast according to the flesh, he says, I'll boast also. I'll boast also. For he says, for you being so wise, tolerate the foolishness gladly. For you tolerate it if anyone enslaves you, anyone devours you, anyone takes advantage of you, anyone exalts himself, anyone hits you in the face. He says, to my shame, I must say that we have been weak in comparison. Right? In comparison to them, we're weak. And Paul is saying, I'm sorry for my weakness. I'm sorry that I'm not boasting so much. I am sorry that I'm not trying to devour you. I'm sorry that I'm not trying to enslave you. I'm sorry that I'm not trying to take advantage of you and I'm not exalting myself. I'm just weak. I'm sorry. But besides that, Paul will say, that's not really the important thing. That's not really what it's all about. But as for that, if that's what you're against me for, I'm sorry for that. Because in that area, I'm very, very weak. And then he says in verse 27, he says, I have been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights and hunger and thirst, often without food and cold and exposure. And apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure of me, concern for all the churches. Who is weak without me being weak? Who is led into sin without my intense concern? You see, the fact that the super apostles are eyeing the Corinthians. Now, you could not imagine, just based on Paul's description, that the super apostles have that kind of concern for the brethren. In fact, I would imagine that if anybody chose to leave, they'd probably just get mad at them. They don't really care about them. They have another agenda. They have another goal. But Paul is very concerned. But Paul is very troubled by the fact that there's this group of people who are trying to draw the Corinthians away from the teachings of the apostles. That they're trying to draw them into another form of religion, another form of Christianity that's claiming and promising all these things. And some of the Corinthians are entertaining this idea, and Paul is concerned about that because he's not there. He can't be there to protect his children. He can't be there to protect his family. He can write this letter, and he can pray, and he can hope, and he can sit and wonder and question and have sleepless nights and wake up concerned, but that's all he can really do. And really, if we're thinking about that idea, Paul's concerned about who is weak and who is lost in sin. I think we can all relate to some degree about that feeling. If you're a parent, if you have children, or if you're a grandparent, you have grandchildren, you have children, then you understand what that feeling's all about. You don't have to be a leader in the church, a preacher or an elder, but you can imagine preachers and elders have that. We feel that way. There's a deep longing and concern for the brethren. But just as a mother or a father or a grandmother or a grandfather, or just as a friend, when we see others that we love and we're concerned about, we can have this deep concern for them, for their spirituality, for their purity, for their love for the Lord. So we can get an idea of what Paul was feeling, but maybe not to the extent of the degree of knowing that there's somebody right there trying to drag them away, trying to persuade them with a different doctrine, trying to teach them false teachings about the Lord. And Paul his hands are tied. His hands are tied, and he's prayerful and he's concerned. Look at verse 30. He says, if I have to boast, I will boast of what pertains to my weakness, for the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. Strange thing to boast about, right? I mean, we don't really boast about our weaknesses. We boast about our strengths. We don't talk about the things we've done wrong. I mean, you would never go into a job interview and said, at my last job, I used to try to leave 15 minutes early, and I would try to get there late, and there were some times where I didn't clock out during lunch and they didn't notice. I mean, we would never say things like that, right? Because that's weakness. But Paul says, no, those are the things I brag about. I brag about those things that make me look weak. I brag about those things that make me look less strong than the super apostles. I brag about the fact that, I'm not an eloquent speaker. I'm not a very good speaker. I'm not a very good teacher. And yes, when you see me, I'm not very impressive. I don't dress that way. I don't look that way. I'm sorry for that. But those are the things I'm going to brag in. Those are the things I want you to see. Those are the things I want to amplify. And look at verse 32. He says, in Damascus, he says that the Ethronarch under Artis, the king, was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. And then he says in verse 33, and I was let down in a basket through a window in a wall, and I escaped his hands. He says, this one time I was in Damascus, and I found out that they were trying to capture me. And you know what I did? I ran and I hid. I didn't confront them. I didn't fight. I didn't bring up an army. I ran and I hid. That's what I did. That's not very impressive. But Paul says that's the kind of stuff he wants them to see in him. He doesn't want to sit there and have to defend all of his credentials or defend his certificate of authenticity. He doesn't want them to see all of his accomplishments. He wants to be recognized as weak. He wants them to see the struggles that he has had. So if you switch over to the next chapter, if you go to chapter 12, starting in verse 1 through 6, Paul says this. He says, boasting is necessary. Boasting is necessary. It's not profitable, but it is necessary. But I will go on in visions and revelations of the Lord. So he's saying, this whole time he's been against the whole idea of trying to boast. He doesn't really want to have to boast. He doesn't want to talk about his credentials or the things that he has seen and accomplished, and he doesn't really want to, but they have forced him to. They have pushed him to it. They have made it to where the gospel of Christ is being hindered because Paul is not saying things about himself. So he's going to say some things that he doesn't really want to say, but it's necessary for the moment so the gospel can continue to spread. And I want you to think about this idea of revelation and this idea of an experience. And we think about spiritual experiences. And, people talk about spiritual experiences. And they think themselves more spiritual because they've had an experience. Or they think themselves more spiritual because they wear a certain garment or clothing. In fact, a lot of times when you see something wearing something like a sash or a robe or something, then you think, that they're trying to communicate a message to you about their spirituality. But then you see Paul and you think, that guy, his clothes, it looks like the guy's been sleeping on a prison floor for a week. Because he has. And you might look at him and think, well, he doesn't look very spiritual. What kind of a spiritual experiences have you had, Paul? You don't wear the garments of a spiritual person. You're not wearing the robe. You're not wearing the sash. You're not wearing the hat. You're not wearing the whatever. How do we know you're spiritual? It's kind of a silly way to think about it in Paul's mind because he's not even in that realm of thinking. That's not how he sees things. He doesn't need that kind of external garment. In fact, he sees his suffering as a sign of his spiritual accomplishments. He sees that the fact that the whole world is against him because of his preaching of the gospel of Jesus as being credibility of his spirituality. But look what he says in verse 2. He says, I know a man. This is his spiritual experience. He says, I know a man 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. Or then he says, such a man, I was caught up in the third heaven. That's kind of the, in their reality, there's tiers of heaven, if you will. Maybe it has to do with the sky and the space and then the heavenly realm where God lives, or it could just be levels of heaven. That was a very common thought. But whatever it is, the third heaven represents the highest place where God dwells. And he says, and I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, he says, I don't know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. And so I don't know, he's talking about himself. I think that's what we need to kind of draw from that. When he's talking about, I know a man, he's talking about himself. And maybe this is just a clever way of Paul to not use that word I, right? Because I just sounds too boastful. He doesn't say I, and when I was in this, I experienced this. No, he says, I know a guy. I know a fella. And, he had this experience. He said, I don't really know a lot about it. It was an experience that was kind of unreal and surreal, but God knows about it, and the experience happened. And the things that I saw and the things that I heard, I'm not even allowed to talk about. That's his experience. Now, this must come on the heels of others coming in and boasting about their experiences and boasting about their visions and telling them all these things that they saw in their vision, all these things that God revealed to them. And here's Paul's experience. And he says, he doesn't even mention his own name. He says, I just know a guy who had an experience, and he went up to the third heaven, and I don't even really know how to talk about it. And I'm not even allowed to say what was said. And that was it. That's Paul's spiritual experience. And then he says in verse 5, he says, on behalf of such a man, I will boast, but on my own behalf I will not boast, except in regard to my weakness. Whatever this experience is, Paul recognizes it was not of him. In other words, Paul is saying that, I didn't have this experience, even though it wasn't really me, it was somebody else, This person didn't have this experience because they were more spiritual. It wasn't because they were more holy. It wasn't because they've achieved spirituality by doing certain things. That's how people tend to think about spirituality, is you have levels of spirituality. Where that word gets thrown around so much, I think it gets really confused. But it wasn't all that much different in their day, that people felt that they become more spiritual. If they give more than everybody else, they're more spiritual. Or maybe if they know more about their Bible, they're more spiritual. Or they may have had experiences, or they've leveled up, if you will, to a level of a spirituality where God has gifted them this vision. But all in all, it's about them. It's something they've achieved. It's something they've done. It's something they've accomplished. It's something they've worked to and built themselves. And Paul says, that's not me. In fact, it wasn't me at all. It was God all along. And it wasn't because I was more spiritual. It was just because of God that he allowed me to have this vision. I don't even know why he allowed me to have the vision. He just allowed me to have the vision. And no, I'm not going to wear a robe to represent the vision. And no, I'm not going to wear a scarf. And no, I'm not going to brag about it. That wasn't the purpose of the vision. That wasn't what it was for. That's not why God did it. But look what he says in verse 6. He says, For if I do wish to boast, he says, I wouldn't be foolish. Now you kind of have to understand this is kind of a little stab of the super apostles, right? Because their boasting, Paul knows, is foolishness. He knows they didn't have these experiences. He knows they're just trying to impress the Corinthians. They're making all this up. Paul knows that because he's had real, genuine, godly experiences. And so he knows it's foolish, but he says, as for me, if I were to boast about something like that, I would not be foolish. For I will be speaking the truth, but I refrain from this so that no one will credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me. So Paul's details are not amplified. He's not going to sit there and brag about all these things and what he saw, because he doesn't want people to give him more credit than he deserves. He doesn't want people to look at him differently. He doesn't want people to give them more credit than he deserves. And we can assume, once again, the super apostles are probably boasting about their spiritual experiences. They're probably trying to impress the Corinthians. And Paul comes in and he says, I really don't want you to give me more credit than I deserve. That yes, I've had these experiences, but it wasn't because of me. Yes, I've seen amazing things, and I've heard things I can't even talk about. And they were real. They weren't false. They weren't made up. They were real. But I'm not going to boast about them, because it wasn't me. It was God. And if I'm going to boast about anything, I'm going to boast about God. I don't want people to look at me differently because of this. Now look at verse 7. He says this, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelation, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, There was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. So you can imagine, then again, the super apostles are boasting, and they're trying to make everybody look at them and look really good, and just trying to impress them and everything else. And Paul sits here and he says, not only do I not want other people to look at me differently, but the Lord knew very well that I could even exalt myself, that I could look at myself differently, that I can have this kind of experience and I can look at myself and I can think, well, good job, Paul. You must have been doing something right. You must have done something really impressive for God to allow you to have this experience. You must have done something really well to impress God. And here are the super apostles, and they're saying, you know what I received from my experience? I have been enlightened. I've received revelation. I have received wisdom. In fact, look at this robe. I got the robe too. I got this hat. And I got this scarf. God gave me these things because of my experience, and I want you to see them, how impressive I am because of my experiences. And Paul says, you know what I got? I got a thorn in the flesh. That's what I got. I got a thorn in the flesh. And we don't even know what the thorn in the flesh was. We don't know what it was that was bothering Paul and what tormented Paul. We don't know what it is, but we know what its purpose is. The purpose of the thorn in the flesh is so Paul would be humbled. The purpose of the thorn in the flesh is so that he won't exalt himself. So it's a reminder to Paul to say, stay humble. It's all about God. It was God's gift to me to give me this experience for the purpose of the spreading of the gospel, and I know that, and it's not about me, it's about God, and I need this reminder. And Paul gave him a thorn in the flesh. And then he says this, he says, concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And so Paul says, at first I didn't understand this. I don't know why I got this. In fact, I didn't like it. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't what I wanted. And I asked the Lord to take it away. In fact, I implored him 3 times. Lord, take this from me. Of course, this reminds us of Jesus, doesn't it? When he is going to the cross and he prays 3 times, remove this cup from me. Paul is like that. And he says, I didn't understand it at first. I thought I needed it gone. And you can imagine that, Lord, I can do so much more. I can go, maybe it's a physical ailment. And Paul would say, how many places I could travel if this wasn't with me? You know how much of an advantage I would have? You know how good I can do? And the Lord just doesn't take it away. But then the Lord does respond, however. He does respond to Paul and give him something to use, give him some reason to continue. In verse 9, and he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Power is perfected in weakness. And Paul said this, he says, most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may dwell within me. I imagine these are words that Paul never forgot. Never. They probably ring in his ear all the time. And any time that Paul feels like he is becoming a little prideful, where Paul feels like he needs to boast, maybe he feels like people aren't paying attention to him and he's done so much, or maybe somebody else has taken credit for something he does. I imagine Paul thinks about this moment 14 years ago when he had this powerful, amazing experience and he came out of it with the thorn and the flesh and the words of Jesus, and he just reminds himself over and over and over, my grace is enough. My grace is sufficient. And my power is not magnified and amplified in your power. My power is not made great in your greatness. My power is not great because you're a great speaker or you're more powerful in your persuasion or more wise in the scriptures. That's not where my power is manifested and made great. But my power is made great through weakness. Your inefficiencies, if you will. Your weakness, your humility, your willingness, that's where I work best. I don't work well in prideful people. I don't work well who believe that their spiritual achievements are based on their accomplishments. I don't work well with people who think they're better than everybody else. I don't work well with people who think they're stronger and faster and mightier and wiser and more powerful. I work through people who know they're not. I work best through people who are weak, so that my power is manifested through weakness and not through strength, that my grace remains sufficient. And then again, that word grace, it's everything. It's everything that God has done. It is God's gift. It's not just pertaining to salvation, but it's everything. All that God has accomplished, all that God has achieved, all that God has given is His grace. Everything. And Christ says, everything that I have done for you, everything that I have done for you is enough. You do not need anything more. You don't have to go out and become a better speaker. You don't have to go out and become a better dresser. You don't have to go out and become richer or more powerful. You don't have to do any of those things. You just have to trust. And then I can work best through you, through your humility, through your imperfections. If we were to really put a tack in that idea and really drive that fact home, all we have to do is look at Jesus. His entire life was a life of submission. His entire life was a life of humility. His entire life, from his birth through his ministry to the cross, is what he is looking for. That God worked his plan through a man who was willing to submit himself and give himself on a cross so that the power of God may be manifested through him, and his great plan was made known and had its perfection. Not because Christ conquered his enemies with the sword, not because Christ conquered his enemies with his words, not because Christ was more powerful or mightier. He could have, but it's not because of that. But it's because of Christ's willingness to give himself on the cross that made God's perfect plan possible. So the power of God is manifested through the cross and not through the sword. He is the perfect example of that. So this thorn in the flesh is humbling Paul so that Christ can do his great work through a selfless, humble servant rather than a fighting, powerful, boastful one. So that Christ's accomplishment at the cross could be made known through all generations through Paul. Look at verse 10. He says this, therefore I am well content with weakness, right? Knowing all of this and coming to this realization, I am well content with my weakness, with insults, with distress, with persecution, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, Paul says, then I am strong. When I am weak, then I am strong. When there is less of me and there's more of him, then I am strong. Not my strength, but his. And I'm not saying that every struggle that you have is like Paul's struggle. That's not what I'm saying. And I don't believe that's what Paul is saying. It's not the point. It's not saying that every weakness that you may have or may be a thorn in the flesh that you might be dealing with is put there to keep you humble. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying God did that on purpose for that reason. But what I am saying is that God has given you and me the opportunity, regardless of what struggles we may have, regardless of the thorn in the flesh, regardless of what difficulties or distress we might be in, what persecution we might find ourselves in, regardless of our weakness, God has given an opportunity to tap into his power and his strength and his might through humility and submission to do his work as humble servants of God. So that we can be like Paul and we can recognize that even in the midst of our weakness, God is mighty, God is powerful, and God is willing. In fact, the weaker we are, the more powerful God can be. It's when we get in the way, the problems start to surface. It's when our pride becomes a problem. It's when our boasting becomes an issue. It's when it's more about us and less about Him, that's where the problem is. So maybe we do go through struggles. Maybe we do go through difficulties. Maybe we are striving in some area of our life with a thorn in the flesh that we feel like is just overwhelming. We have to remind ourselves that's not important. Yes, it's important for us in the moment. And yes, God concerns Himself with things of our difficulties. And yes, we pray continually for each other, for those things we struggle with. But what we have to remember is we don't have to become more spiritual. We don't have to become more powerful in that sense. We don't have to become stronger. We don't have to become wiser. We don't have to do any of those things. But what we do need to do is trust God. And that God will work for whatever weakness we may have to do whatever will He may have for us. And it's in those times when we are at our most weakest that God can be at His most powerful, working through us in ways that we could never imagine, doing abundantly more than we can ever think or imagine or dream of. And that's where Paul had to be with his reality so that he can truly be the apostle that God has called him to be. God doesn't need your strength. God doesn't need your wisdom. God doesn't need you to somehow make yourself more spiritual. God needs your faith. God needs your trust. That's what He needs. And He will work through your weakness to bring about the perfect results of His power and His might. So just keep this verse in mind, this passage of Scripture. Be mindful of these things as we continue to do the work of the Lord. As the Lord says to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. If there's anybody here this morning, maybe you have struggles. And we all have struggles, some more than others, but maybe your struggle is overwhelming to you, and maybe you need us to pray for you. If you have a prayer that you would like us to pray for, something, allow us to do that for you so we can work together as a community of God. Or maybe you've never put on Christ in baptism. Maybe you've never been immersed in water and received the Spirit as a gift of God. That's available to you. If you believe in Jesus, if you're willing to repent, if you're willing to walk in the light, if you're willing to become part of the community of God and you have sin in your life, the opportunity to become part of the family of God and have your sins forgiven is available to you this morning to be immersed in water and baptism. Whatever your desire might be, if you would please come forward as we stand and as we sing.